Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to African Political Thought. It's a very grey and snowy day out there, so I put on a very colourful shirt to both cheer myself up, but hopefully help cheer you up as well. Today we're going to be talking about some gentlemen who, by and large, apart from their medals, don't dress up in colourful ways. They wear uniforms, and it's very, very much an examination of military rule in Africa. Whether or not there was a species of thought associated with different forms of military rule, we're leaving out, for the most part, liberation leaders, those who put on the uniform of guerrilla fighters to struggle against white minority rule. We've already had a look at people like Cabral. Next week, we'll be having a look at somebody like Mugabe, although he was never strictly speaking a military commander of the liberation movement. But what we're going to be looking at today are those people who were already in uniform and who decided from their position of being in the armed forces to seize power. To seize power in a non-constitutional fashion, always with the best of declared public intent, not always able to deliver what it was that they promised, and very, very much in some cases producing disaster, despite what were probably early good intentions. But lest the phenomenon of the African military ruler be misunderstood, of course, there's a long history of such rulers around the world. For a long time in my youth, before Africa began gaining independence, then the archetype of the military ruler came from South America. And of course, in living memory in Europe, certainly in the memory of your parents, then we had military governments, the governments of Portugal, Spain, Greece, Turkey, were military governments. Military governments continue in a variety of guises. Sometimes they take off their uniforms and put on suits. This is essentially what Mobutu in Zaire did. He put on very elegant suits, as we discussed last week. It's what President Sisi in Egypt has done, following the tradition of those who preceded him as military presidents, senior officers who became civilian quote-unquote presidents. Not a very convincing transition in the Egyptian cases, far from a convincing transition in the case of Zaire. Those who never put off the uniform but wore it for the duration of their time as military presidents, that is what is going to concern us today, and they fall into a whole variety of received images. We have this image of Idi Amin in Uganda. He was the president there from 71 to 1979. We have this image of him as a completely irrational buffoon, not knowing what he was doing. Now, in fact, the film The Last King of Scotland captures, I think, a portrait of Amin very, very well, not as someone who was stupid, not as someone who was a buffoon, certainly as someone who was incredibly volatile and certainly to that extent unpredictable. Certainly someone who was ruthless, not always given to fine judgments as to who his enemies and therefore victims were going to be. And as I've said to you, I think before, when I went to Uganda as part of the cleanup after Amin, I found not only devastation of a scale that I had up to that point in time not seen before, but I found a complete meltdown in terms of governmental and administrative apparatus, and I found trauma. The civil servants that I was meant to be retraining so that government could start again spoke often to me of their fear, of their dread of being picked, And when I asked, what does this mean to be picked? They said it was our euphemism for saying that you were going to be marched off to die, to be executed immediately if you were lucky, to be tortured to death if you were unlucky. And they showed me the locations of torture and execution, showed me the bridges where the bodies of those executed were thrown off. And one encountered almost an entire nation in trauma after what they had been through. And yet he had at the beginning tacit support from the British. He was regarded in the early stages as a credible person to bring some sense of order to Uganda after what was perceived internationally as the volatility and unpredictability of Milton Obote, the civilian president who preceded Amin. Amin, of course, had very little training in public administration or in the arts of government, and was, as we know, a disaster, but not quite the buffoon that people painted him as. And I think that Forrest Whitaker, in the film Last King of Scotland, does a very, very reasonable job of trying to portray him as multidimensional. Other people who are regarded as in this genre of the buffoon military dictator include Jean Bedel Bokassa in the Central African Republic. He was the president there, a civilian president from 66 to 76 after having taken power in a coup. He didn't keep his uniform on, but then substituted it from 76 to 79 in the robes of an emperor, modeling himself after Napoleon. So he became, for a while, Emperor Bokassa, and renamed the Central African Republic as the Central African Empire. He was taken seriously by the French, an ally in that part of Africa, almost flattered that he was imitating Napoleonic airs and the throne that Napoleon sat upon. Bokassa made a replica of that, and in every single respect tried, in superficial imagistic terms at least, to be an African exemplar of a moment of French history. So the carnivalesque, as Mbembe would have put it, together with, of course, the politics of the necropolis, were associated with people like Jean-Bertrand Bokassa. But what I did in my book, Grasping Africa, and I've given you, I think, the complete manuscript on the BLE page, I tried to offer a typology of African dictatorships, military dictatorships. So what we had, a series of 7 of them, in the beginning of chapter 8 of that book. Firstly, ruthless, military-originated, family-based kleptomania, Mobutu of Zaire. We discussed him last week. Secondly, what I've just spoken about, ridiculous-seeming military splendor, Amin of Uganda, Jean Bedel Bokassa, in his briefly named Central African Empire. 3. Ruthless military dictatorship crudely reliant on cultural manipulation as much as force of arms, Taylor of Liberia, preceded by Samuel Doe of Liberia. And we'll be having a look at particularly Samuel Doe a little bit later on. Fourthly, ruthless military dictatorship with all the same a technocratic base, Abacha of Nigeria. 5. Technocratic military dictatorship with impulses towards the return of civilian democracy, Obasanjo of Nigeria in the 1970s. I wrote my MA dissertation precisely in the 1970s, examining his timetable for the return to civilian rule, which he executed. 6, and I'll be talking about these people a little bit later on, idealistic military dictatorship involving younger officers, Rawlings of Ghana and Sankara of Burkina Faso. But youth by itself wasn't enough. So my category number 7 incompetent military dictatorship involving younger officers, people like Momo of Sierra Leone. So you have here a typology which could be further broken down. You could make, as it were, a rough distinction between idealistic younger officers, some of whom were competent and some of whom were, as I said, incompetent, and the older generation. Now, what interests me about some of the younger officers, particularly Jerry Rawlings and Thomas Sankara, was that they modeled themselves at first, in any case, after another young officer who had seized power in Libya. Colonel Gaddafi, who held power from 1969 to 2011, before he was overthrown and shot in a NATO-supported regime change. What you had in Libya was ruthlessness, of course, and the citizens, particularly the students of Benghazi, never forgave him, which is why the overthrow of Gaddafi in the Arab Spring began in Benghazi. Gaddafi had executed the student leaders who wanted freer speech by basically hanging them from the lampposts with wire nooses, and they were left to be strangled to death from those wire nooses, and also at the same time gradually cut into their necks, a very, very painful form of execution. So not a person given to idealism alone, but in the sense of from the very start defying the West, from the very start trying to propose a new form of thought. Basically, Gaddafi himself modeled what he was trying to say in turn upon Chairman Mao. He wanted to have an African, Arabic version of the Little Red Book, for instance, which he called the Little Green Book, which spoke, of course, to the color of the Libyan flag, which spoke to his dream of making green again the desert, of basically transforming Libya. And in fact, he did. The standard of living in Libya, based on the oil revenues, not always equitably distributed, but distributed well enough so that it was, to a large extent, at the time of his overthrow, a middle-class country. Electricity, water, higher education, the equality, at least on paper, of women. And despite all the fantastic trappings that accompanied him, the carnival that accompanied him wherever he went, the carnival remarked upon even in other African countries as completely over the top, his original early idealism, his attempt at thought, inspired people like Sankara and particularly Jerry Rawlings. So you have a younger generation who never really were able to accomplish their military careers and rise to high office militarily. Some who were, let us say, less endowed with intellectual ambition, like Staff Sergeant Samuel Doe in Liberia, in the end, after he took power, had himself promoted all the way to Field Marshal, but never earned any of his ranks by the normal means of military merit. People who did, as in Nigeria's case, General Obasanjo, later General Abacha, and a whole string, a succession of generals, at least rose to gaining the stars on their epaulets by military merit. Whether that made them meritorious presidents, that's something which is another question entirely. But you have, as I say, these differences of approach to military rule. Let's say a few things about some of the younger officers who were not particularly successful. Someone like Joseph Momo, who seized power in Sierra Leone, held it from 1985 to 1992. Completely disastrous government, gave rise to armed rebellion which racked Sierra Leone for years, although to be fair, the violence in Liberia crossed over and inflamed both of these countries that had been founded in the first instance by freed African slaves, Liberia by freed slaves from the United States and Britain provided the freed slaves for Sierra Leone. But as I said in my very, very first lecture in this course, the freed slaves who went to Liberia were strangers in the new country, which was not a new country at all. Other people, older peoples, lived there and were marginalized and basically driven into the hinterland by what were essentially black colonialists. And these people who were marginalized never forgot that. Some of the cleavages that continue in Liberia to this day are a result of that. The terrible civil wars that spilled over into Sierra Leone, as I said, featuring people like Charles Taylor, who has been found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity by a special United Nations tribunal. People like Taylor followed in the footsteps of Samuel Doe in claiming, at least, and Doe really did come from the hinterland, Taylor probably emulated an ancestry of that sort, although basically his formation was very, very much as a descendant of those who came from the United States of America. But the power of the hinterland was demonstrated by Doe, particularly in terms of his affiliation to magical cultural practices. So he was regarded by his enemies as essentially invulnerable. He could not be overthrown because of his devotion to the old ways. Now, the old ways as run amok, as bastardized, for want of another word, to provide protection for fighters, particularly young fighters, during the civil war that erupted in the wake of Samuel Doe, those were captured by Stephen Ellis in his book, The Mask of Anarchy, one of the great works in terms of African politics and the anthropology of African politics, where he talks about the condensation of ritual into a way of initiating young fighters, in the end young female fighters as well, a condensation and a bastardization of ancient rituals known as poro, a coming of age, which were meant to make people imbibe the powers of the spirit world and attain a form of invulnerability in the material world, particularly when fighting as young warriors. Now, Stephen Ellis gives, I think, a very, very vivid account of Poro, particularly its condensed form. Many rumors surrounded the new form of Poro, including cannibalism, whether that was true or not, or a misunderstanding, just as many people in ancient Rome, for instance, misunderstood the early Christian rituals. Christ at the Last Supper saying, "Take, eat, this means my body. Take, drink, this means my blood." Many people who were enemies of the Christians took this literally, that the Christians were thereby a cannibalistic sect. Whether or not genuine cannibalism existed in the exigency of the moment, whether or not it was purely metaphorical, imbibing the strength from your enemies, that remains to be seen. Certainly Charles Taylor was rumored to be a participant in such rituals, literal rituals. Samuel Doe had access to a vast panoply of such rituals and magical arts, so that when he did finally die, he was tortured to death, and it took days to torture him to death. And those who were tasked with torturing him to death, and I put up a video of this on the BLE page, not for the faint-hearted, were basically in awe that, hey, the magic works, this man refuses to die. He did, in the end, an awful death, probably in keeping if one is minded to think that revenge is a proper way of executing somebody's legacy, as it were, as well as the person himself, a proper revenge perhaps for those that he had likewise killed in a painful manner. But Samuel Doe represented the revenge of the hinterland against the metropolis that had been founded in the image of Black America. A major question mark, therefore, arises over this episode as to the nature of Pan-African thought and whether or not it can really transcend continents easily like that, or whether in its attempt to transcend continents displaces traditional ways, traditional cultural ways that return to haunt those who have imposed themselves upon an ancient Africa. So questions of that sort to do with political thought certainly intrude. So we began with Blyden, we began with people like Webb Du Bois, and the problematique that addresses them is particularly the problematique as enunciated by people like Samuel Doe and his successor Charles Taylor. Those of you, again, who are not faint-hearted should certainly look at the book by Stephen Ellis. It's a harrowing read, but as a work of the anthropology of African politics and the thought accompanying a disastrous period of African politics, then this is one of the great books of the Africanist literature. But let's have a look at, let us say, more secular thought on the part of young leaders. People indeed like Jerry Rawlings and Thomas Sankara. Rawlings was basically in power in the 1980s. He had basically taken power in a coup at the beginning of the 1980s and then immediately resigned, saying that he was trying to clear the way for a properly elected civilian government, which was duly elected underneath President Hilla Lilman, who was not a great success as a civilian democratically elected government. And Rawlings came again in 1981. I've spoken to you about the story that the slums of Accra knew he was coming again to the very hour and the very day. Those in government certainly seemed not to know. And he was in power from 1981, the end of 1981, to the beginning of 1993. He legitimized himself by taking off the uniform in due course and putting on a suit or affecting forms of African dress. He himself is half Scottish, I hasten to add. So he, in the end, subjected himself to elections, won them, and oversaw the transition from his regime to a democratically founded Ghanaian civilian succession of regimes, which continue to this day, although elections are contested and sometimes the result bitterly contested. The result of the last, quite recent Ghanaian elections has not been accepted by the opposition, but by and large there have been accepted results with a genuine change of power, political parties as well as leaders of those political parties. But Rawlings began in office as an idealistic acolyte of Colonel Gaddafi. He wanted to rule by popular committees, which was also a way, of course, of spying on people. You could pick out who was a dissident in the local committees who were meant to be popular. You could target them, if not for incarceration, at least for careful watching. A control vehicle as well as a purported grassroots democratic vehicle that was meant to be closer to the way that African consultative community building had been in the past. Of course, it was nothing of the sort, because in Ghana, as I said to you, you had a succession of different kinds of government traditionally. At the same time, you could have great empires, and you could have flat-line, horizontally led societies, sometimes at loggerheads with one another, sometimes part of empires that crossed over the modern borders of today's Africa, sometimes very, very condensed entities that held sway on what the British came to call the Gold Coast, for instance. So you have this whole variety of forms of traditional governance and governments, and to say that popular committees were an emulation of what had once been is perhaps to suggest some kind of affiliation to the flat-line governance of some forms of society in ancient Ghana. But those flat-line committees didn't report to a national centralized government. In fact, the idea of a centralized government in the size and shape of modern Ghana simply did not appear in people's imagination in the days of old. So it was very, very much a direct steal from Gaddafi, which was in turn a direct steal from Chairman Mao. And in Mao's early China, of course, what you had in terms of the commune committees were precisely a means of surveillance as well as a means of community organization, and successful very, very much in the countryside as a means of organizing agricultural production. That kind of agricultural production was not possible, of course, in Libya, despite the green aspirations of Gaddafi, and difficult even in Ghana with a variation of landscape, jungle, the edges of the desert and other places, the different kinds of vegetation actually that existed on the coastal areas, the prevalence of malaria. All of these things made a direct emulation of China very, very difficult indeed. But the idea at first was very much to have this control variable disguised underneath a form of populism. And this, of course, couldn't work. A localism couldn't work in the face of the tremendous problems that Ghana was facing, caused, I have to say, by the inept governmental administration of Nkrumah. The great apostle of Pan-Africanism was not very adept at modern public administration and modern technocratic developmental planning. Wanted to do far too much in far too much of a hurry without underpinning it economically, and caused huge dislocations in terms of Ghana's economic position vis-à-vis the outside world. In other words, you can't repudiate an international capitalist system simply by saying so, going your own way nationally, without some kind of trading with the international system, particularly in terms of your key agricultural and mineral products, is essentially impossible. Try to understand the conditionalities that come with this kind of relationship with the outside world, which is very different to your relationship with your colonial forebears, the colonial administration that existed beforehand. No matter whether it's called neo-colonialism or not, its mechanics are totally different. The flow of funds might seem to be the same, but within that there is, as I say, a world of technocratic and economic difference and complexity, which Nkrumah never got. And so what you had was such a massive lack of value of the local currency, the cedi. Neither Nkrumah nor his immediate successors dared to devalue the cedi because that would have meant an even higher increase in the cost of living, because if you bought anything that had been imported, then the cost of that was going to be very, very high, and higher if the cedi was officially devalued. So that the key economic instruments that needed to be implemented, these continued not to be implemented, and Rawlings at first didn't want to implement dire fiscal reform. But he realized that his popular committee approach wasn't going to work. It was sowing discontent anyway. People knew they were being spied upon. So he turned to the professor of economics at the National University, Professor Botchway, and basically sat at Botchway's feet for week upon week for something like 2 years, learning modern economics, and began negotiating with the IMF, and was able to negotiate in such expert terms that the IMF were prepared to ameliorate to an extent their normal rigor in terms of conditions applied to limiting the cost of public administration, that Rawlings was basically able to get away with making a pact with the devil, with the IMF as it were. Very, very rigorous, difficult, hard, but all the same let us say humanely, if you can call it that, regulated implementation of the IMF recipe, to the extent that it became the new model adopted by the IMF itself and regarded both in Ghana and by the IMF as a huge success, each side claiming, as it were, a greater degree of the success because of their efforts than the other. Which means that when you look at Rawlings, you're actually looking at a technocratic success, a success for technocratic thought built around an appreciation of modern international economics, not in the ideological form of critiquing modern international economics, but by simply adapting to them, negotiating within their constraints, and trying to do the best possible. Now, I had a number of friends in other African countries and indeed in the Caribbean. They all became ministers of finance, and in two cases, they became prime ministers of both Tanzania and of Zambia. The Minister of Finance in Jamaica, Hugh Small, never rose to become prime minister, but the other two did. And at first, particularly in the case of Jamaica and Tanzania, they were tasked by their presidents to tour the world looking for alternative sources of finance to that provided by the IMF, and were completely unable in those days, before the rise of China as a lender of liquidity, they were totally unable to find any kind of alternative resource to the IMF. In Zambia, the prime minister, before that the finance minister, Kibi Musakatwane, was able to, again, like Rawlings, learn to negotiate with the IMF so successfully that all kinds of jealousies back home arose against him, people jealous of his success, and perhaps even President Kaunda jealous of his success. And he didn't last very long as Prime Minister. He received, as it were, no reward in terms of recognition for his work, whereas Rawlings, towards the end of his tenure in power, certainly was regarded as the person who had transformed the fortunes of Ghana. Now, this is controversial, of course, because you begin as a left-wing radical in the wake of the image of Gaddafi, early Gaddafi, and you wind up the darling of the Washington consensus. At the same time, Rawlings having recently died and having lain in state funeral, all in the last few weeks, is whether people were his enemies or not, from a different political party or not, whether or not they were reminded of some of his own early ruthlessness as a military ruler. He executed a lot of other generals. Basically understand that he did something significant for the country. So one kind of thought, and of course he affected a dashing image as a young flight lieutenant driving around potholed Accra in a racing green MGB GT. Those of you who don't know what that car is, it was the sports car of the young men of his era. Racing green was greatly to be desired. I hasten to add that mine was flame orange, so that you had this, as it were, ostentation. You drove around Accra, trying not to crash into potholes, the top down, wearing aviator sunglasses, looking like a Hollywood hero. You played rock and roll, guitarist. You did everything that a young man was meant to do. And of course, this was an incredible appeal to a constituency built around urban youth and built around the market mamas, the women traders of the Accra downtown markets and the markets serving the needs of the ghetto. A populist outreach, therefore, a youthful outreach, an appeal to the image of Colonel Gaddafi, and sufficient popularity together with sufficient decision to acquire sufficient learning to negotiate with the IMF, a most unorthodox package. So you have that, and to a certain extent it had parallels with Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara was in office from 1983 to 1987. He took power in a coup. He never took off his uniform. He himself was assassinated, probably by rival officers. Before he was assassinated, he accomplished basically things that made him a legend. When he took office, the country was called Opavota, Francophonic territory. The capital, Ouagadougou, was the subject of all kinds of demeaning rumors, except that the rumors about what it looked like were true. I had friends who were Mennonite missionaries who spent time in Upper Volta. They described that the city, the capital city, was demarcated by two roundabouts. The two roundabouts were linked by a road. The road ran through a dusty collection of dusty buildings, and that was the capital. You wouldn't recognize it now. It's a modern capital. It's the home, the host of the African Film Festival. It's a place, a center of culture. It looks like a country that has transformed itself, certainly in terms of the city. It's still a country that is facing a renewed form of Islamic jihadist infiltration and violence. So all kinds of security problems there at this moment in time. But during the time of Thomas Sankara, it was not a time so much of urban transformation, although that began underneath his reign. It was the time of rural transformation. He was inspired by the image of Gaddafi. He was also inspired by the image of Che Guevara, dashing young men. He himself was a dashing young man, a motorcyclist, so he didn't have an MGB GT, motorcycles, guitars, aviator sunglasses, the whole package. And these young people were precisely of that age of idealism, and precisely at that age where they thought they could defy links with the outside world that were not on their terms and conditions. Now, the difference between Ghana and Upper Volta, which Thomas Sankara renamed Burkina Faso, the country of upright people, the difference was that Ghana had been rich and Upper Volta had never been. So the desire of Rawlings was to restore a condition of wealth. The mission of Thomas Sankara was to develop the country so it could become wealthier, but it never had a status quo ante to which it was returning. So relationships with the external powers, and particularly the external colonial power, in this case France, it didn't matter what France thought or did. It couldn't make things any worse. Indeed, the French president, François Mitterrand, probably the most complicated figure of the left who's ever held power in any Western country, probably the most complicated figure of the left anywhere in modern history, came and visited Thomas Sankara and tried in a very paternalistic way to lecture him, look here, young man, type of thing. But Sankara stood up to the grand old man of the complex left and said, no, we're going to do it our own way. It was a legendary exchange. It was filmed. Some fragments of it you can find on YouTube. You have to be able to understand French to understand the exchange. Mitterrand didn't go out of his way, therefore, to help Thomas Sankara, but he was impressed enough by the young man not to go out of his way either to hinder or to harass or make life unduly difficult for him. But as well as refusing a pact with the colonial devil, as it were, France, Sankara also refused to negotiate with the IMF. He got away with it at the time. Other countries that have tried to do this more recently, like Eritrea, are conspicuously underdeveloped and Stalinistic in terms of maintaining discipline. Whether Thomas Sankara would have become Stalinistic in due course had he survived is another question. But because he did not, and because he stood up for the independence of Burkina Faso, he's regarded as a hero, and particularly what he did in terms of three things. The first is his drive for public health. He vaccinated 2.5 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. And at the same time, accompanied this public health drive with a public adult literacy drive, and raised both life expectancy and literacy level to hitherto undreamt of levels. He transformed agriculture, and he did this by two means. He planted over 10 million trees to halt the desertification of the country, the desert sands coming down from the Sahel. Introducing new methods of agronomy, he doubled wheat production. He completely transformed the rural tax structure, reducing them for peasants, and an ambitious road network to tie up the nation so that agricultural produce could be brought out from the producers to the marketplaces in the cities, and also fertilizers and other needs, inputs to agriculture, could be taken in to them. And basically at the same time to emancipate the rural producer from the traditional power of the chiefs. So that agriculture was the second great pillar, which was accompanied by a reduction of traditional power structures. In other words, a greater autonomy given to the local producer, as well as modern means of production being introduced to the countryside, facilitated by a transport network which he developed, and of course a longevity of life in terms of public health and a greater literacy. All of these things basically went together. And the public health drive, of course, meant that there was a greater access to facilities to do with health. He built over 350 clinics in local villages, for instance. But it was his commitment to the equality and the better treatment of women that gained the most praise. The first feminist president, as it were, of Africa, both in his writings on this and what he actually did. He basically put his money where his mouth was. His mouth basically said that women should be regarded as equal, and he went out of his way in terms of his policies actually to make women at least more equal. He outlawed female genital mutilation, he outlawed forced marriages, he outlawed polygamy, he appointed women to high governmental positions up to ministerial level, and basically said that this was the way of the future in which everybody should be upright and free and equal, including people who were female alongside people who were male. We don't have any record of his views about gay, lesbian, and trans relationships and the status of such people. Certainly in terms of gender, he was very, very much a pioneer and someone who achieved great things. His popularity among the female constituency was, of course, very huge, and he became an icon to the African poor and also to the female part of the African poor. Now, I said that we don't know whether he would have become more Stalinist as he stayed in power, because, as I said, he was assassinated. He certainly was becoming more authoritarian. When you suppress the rule of the chiefs, you don't ask them politely to go. You basically make them go. When you are developing an urban society, you're beginning to do that at least. This also means that you're beginning to develop a working class that is urbanized. And so he suppressed the unions, meant to be a key adjunct of workers' rights, and they were suppressed. If he was going to be totally dedicated in terms of going it alone against the IMF and against France, he's going to take criticism. So he suppressed a sense of freedom of the press. And he wasn't above putting on trial counter-revolutionaries, even putting on trial lazy workers and, wait for it, People's Revolutionary Tribunals. In other words, the popular committees of Rawlings, of Gaddafi, of Chairman Mao. They made their appearance also in Thomas Sankara's regime. but because he was determined to be self-reliant, because he was determined to transform agriculture, transform literacy, transform public health, all the essentials of life, and as I say, above all, transform the lot and the aspirational possibilities of women. What you had was the creation of a legend, and because he was young, because he was handsome, all of these things went into the mix. Not particularly well traveled. His officer formation was in Madagascar. So, insofar as he had entertained ideas which could be identified as Marxist, very quasi Marxist, I hasten to add, because before him there wasn't a working class in Burkina Faso, he probably acquired his Marxist quote unquote formation in Madagascar. This poses a problem for students of the left who wish to try to find a universal form of Marxism as a means of analyzing international economic conditions. And one of the problems is that none of us know very much about the Madagascan Marxist left. And it's made it more problematic in that Madagascar, although a member of the African Union, the smallest continent, some call it, although Australia probably lays claim to that, the largest island, although Australia probably also lays claim to that. But let us say Madagascar, or the Malagasy Republic, to give it its proper name, although part of Africa never had an African indigenous history. It was populated by people brought in from the outside, Indian indentured labor, for instance, later black African slaves. So you had a mixture of population, some Chinese population as well. You have a proper Indian Ocean society, very, very mixed, heterogeneous society, taking influences from a wide variety of sources and transforming them into a peculiar Malagasy way of thinking about themselves as simultaneously exotic and unique, African but Asian at the same time, and adapting a Marxism to suit their local conditions. What Sankara made of that, we don't really know, and how he tried to adapt that, we have no line of descent in intellectual terms that will allow us to interrogate that. What we do have by way of a legacy, so we can interrogate his work, are a succession of books. And I've put one or two of these up on the BLE page. These are not sustained writings. These are collections of essays, occasional writings. These are collections of speeches, but they're coherent in the sense that they speak to the directions of his thought, which I've tried to describe to you in this particular lecture. So what you can say about him is that he was not a thinker who tried to deviate across a whole range of inspirational foundations or a whole range of aspirational goals. His thinking was coherent. The thinking of an idealistic young person, the thinking of a modernizer, and the thinker of someone who believed passionately in equality as a foundational virtue for taking the country forward, but also a foundational value enunciated in the name he gave the country. You had to be upright, you had to be moral. In other words, the moral certainty of the revolution was something which could have become a virtue made dictatorial, made Stalinist, if he had been in power for a lengthy period of time. Those who came after him, it's an open question as to the extent to which they corrupted his revolution, or whether they took it forward into the realms as it was inevitably going to have to go forward into, that is, the creation of an oligarchic class, an elite, the advent of corruption. All of these things might have come about alongside the possibility of Stalinism if he was going to try to constrain the development of an elite, oligarchic, corrupt class, for instance. And enforced equality is always going to be enforced by dictatorial means, just as the ideals of the French Revolution were enforced in the end by Napoleon, the inspiration of John Bedell Picasso. So when we look at African military political rule, we're looking at a collection of differences. There's no one image that pertains to this phenomenon. Just like in Europe, you can't say that the Portuguese military rulers were the same as the Spanish military rulers, despite both being Hispanic. They weren't similar necessarily to those in Latin America, despite, again, Hispanic connections. Each form of military rule bore the imprint of the local national conditions upon which it was founded. So certainly the Greek military governments, the juntas there were very, very different to those that you would find in other parts of Europe. So the question then is, what kind of imprint of a national sort comes from nations in formation? Because when you look at Jerry Rawlings, he came to power in the 1980s. Military governments had preceded him, but really you're only looking at less than a quarter of a century after independence. The country is still a work in progress in more ways than one, not just economically. Same in Burkina Faso. The country came to independence in the 1960s. Sankara came 23 years later, and certainly found a country in need of formation, certainly found a nation in need of an identity that was not marred in poverty. Others, like Idi Amin, came to power in Uganda that was meant to be one of the jewels in the British colonial crown. It was administered like the British administered India. It was regarded as sufficiently advanced so that it could take that kind of rule, although there, as in India, in Uganda, the British did their classical divide and rule tactics so that some of the ethnic tensions that still exist in Uganda to this day basically derive from those divisions that were not so much enforced but stimulated by the British in terms of their favouring one group over another, to whom they gave aristocratic titles because of the organization underneath a kingship society made it possible for the transfer of aristocratic recognition by British means, so that people who would have been dukes and kings in their traditional society became knights of the British Empire, as in northern Nigeria and to a much lesser extent in Ghana, for instance. So that you had in Uganda a site of great traditional development, although a very divided form of traditional development, whereas Idi Amin became one of the continent's spectacular examples of maladroit military rule. Righteous military rule arose in a country like Burkina Faso, which is one of the poorest countries in Africa, one of the most underdeveloped, one of those that certainly had not benefited from the French formation of a highly educated elite. So different conditions produce sometimes very, very baffling results. And just as different conditions gave rise to different results, what you had were different forms of military rule by very different personages. Military rule that tried to appeal to traditional values, but at the same time reform those values. So down with the chiefs, down with female inequality, tried to project images of modernity, so up with the young rock and roll stars who rode around town on their motorbikes and in their AMG BGTs, but also gave rise to an image which I think is most fixed to Thomas Sankara of the military ruler with great power who lived modestly. He never departed from his frugal house. He basically had a collection of guitars, a couple of motorbikes, and one deep freeze that never worked properly. And that was it. He never became an oligarch. He never became a big man in terms of wealth. He was certainly a big man in terms of the power at his command. Revered today, an icon for the young because he died young, like Che Guevara, like rock stars who die young. They, in a very curious way, live forever. Are they good models? Do they provide good templates for today? Well, that's a big question. Hopefully, the era of military rule has come to an end or is slowly dying. Hopefully, the era of democracy, no matter how problematic, is rising. Would Sankara have done well in a democratic system if he had restored or brought democracy to Burkina Faso? These are open questions. The wake of Jerry Rawlings has brought democracy, contested bitterly, sometimes very beneficially, from time to time. And as for the grand old military presidents of Nigeria, President Obasanjo, he was a military ruler in the 1970s. He became a civilian ruler, elected 1999 to 2007. Technocratic, benign, even if controversial, of course, returned the country to civilian rule, is not, let us say, subject to too many scandalous rumors about acquisition of unfair wealth. Unlike his successor as a military president, Sani Abacha, the military ruler of Nigeria from 93 to 98, not quite in the kleptomaniac class of someone like Mobutu, certainly stole enough that they're still uncovering where he hid his loot in international bank accounts to this day. As I say, you don't become corrupt just in your own country. You need the whole help of the international financial community to smuggle and to circulate your wealth and to hide it. But the commonality between both Obasanjo and Abacha is that they knew what they were doing. In other words, Nigeria may not have progressed greatly underneath their rulerships. They, however, could be said to have stabilized. Nigeria is an incredibly complex country. By that I mean not just in terms of its ethnic and religious distinctions, but in terms of basically its sources of production, its sources of wealth, its place internationally, its place regionally, its place in the African Union as the provider of peacekeeping soldiers, etc., etc. In other words, what you had was a grown-up country, albeit with huge growing pains, not necessarily an adolescent country in terms of the way that it was seen in many parts of Africa and certainly by the outside world, ruled over by military leaders who had a technocratic foundation, who had risen through the ranks because of military merit, and who were not young people who were successful like Sankara and Rawlings in different ways, and not like young rulers who are unsuccessful in very different ways, like Joseph Momo in Sierra Leone and Samuel Doe in Liberia. But here again, it bespeaks the range of military rule. It bespeaks a phenomenon which I don't think has been studied properly in terms of its full complexity. The blanket, as it were, epithet, oh, an African military man in uniform, that doesn't do justice to a phenomenon which was complex, which led to good results and bad results, and which in the case of Sankara established an icon that is still an aspirational icon for many young people in Africa today. So next week, ladies and gentlemen, we go on to someone who is not an icon anymore, although his influence still lingers, but someone who is regarded as a great hero in his younger days, and that's Robert Mugabe. So until we come to Robert Mugabe, let's wait till we meet again in class to discuss the African military ruler and what thought came from them, what thought pertains to them. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.